Time happened. You happened. But none of that matters. We're together again, and I'll have the resolution you denied me.
She bounds across the room, her fists ready, her heart set upon your destruction. With a horrifying squelch, you are unwound.
Hello, everyone out there. This is the Furidashi podcast. I am Nicholas. I'm here with my delightful, wonderful, superb, and maybe even brilliant friend, Lauren. Lauren, can you say hi to everybody?
Hi, everyone. I was not expecting to give a compliment dish down on Nicholas today as part of our introduction, but instead I will just say Happy New Year. And as always, I'm so glad to be here chatting with you, Nicholas, where we can just shoot the shit together.
Yeah, happy 2025 to all of our beloved listeners out there, freebies as well as Secret Squad. We're glad you came back. We know the world is in a state at the moment right now, and so we are extremely grateful for the fact that you decided to spend yet another hour with us this month, and hopefully another hour with us this month, because you can go over to patreon.com/Furidashi, where the subject of today's episode will be discussed in even greater detail with even more annoying philosophical references than I'm usually throwing out there. You can sign up for $5 a month and you can get access to our full, enormous, absolutely juicy, delicious. Can anyone tell that I'm cooking a pot roast right now? Back catalog of bonus episodes, as well as the old Furidashi Classroom episodes, which are a really great introduction into various issues related to game design. So if that's your thing, or if you really just want to hear Lauren and I talk more about the sorts of things that we talk about on the free episodes, you can go over there and sign up, and we will be deeply grateful for you to do so. So today we are going to be talking about violence. Is violence good? Question mark. Is
And
violence?
And also with all the things going on in the world, a lot of us escape into video games. And so what better way to get out your violence than, getting that violence out in a healthy way, not into your fellow humans, but into your non-sentient, right, video game characters. But more importantly, we want to talk also about violence and the aesthetics of violence, right?
Yeah.
Why violence exists in video games, but also like when violence is a part of the story, what does that do for the story? So Nicholas.
So in effort to broach this extremely large subject that we'll probably keep coming back to, we're going to be talking about a game from 2023 called Slay the Princess. I almost said Slay the Spire, and that would have been wrong. That's not the game. Slay the Princess. So Slay the Princess was it's straightforwardly a visual novel that was kind of caught people by surprise in 2023. A really fascinating game, not just because of the way it deals with sort of like the branching logic of sort of like the choose your own adventure style games that are typically made as visual novels these days, but also because of the way in which it maps that branching logic onto a kind of multiverse within the game's story. And we'll be talking a little bit about, sort of the framing device of the game, but then also like how you discover the framing device. And also the fact that in many ways, the narrative itself is constructed as an act of violence that you, the player, perpetrate on the story. And we're going to have to make the classic distinction between narrative and story, and I'll talk about that in a second. So an act of violence that you perpetrate on the story for the benefit of this enigmatic, multi-armed, possibly divine, actually probably is divine creature who you encounter as first and foremost a princess, but then through the course of the story you start to learn more and more about who this princess character actually is and why the game told you to kill her. Because it does, it tells you a lot.
Yeah.
All the time, kill her, go kill her.
I think for me, what's going to be really fascinating as we talk about it as well is understanding, like Nicholas is talking about, the difference between narrative and story, right? As well as the framing device that's used in this game. The game
Yeah,
is called Slay the Princess, but it's not as simple as slaying the princess. There is no, you could say, like deeper, like story or plot hooked for why the princess needs to be killed in what you could consider a conventional sense. Like, oh, this princess is a villain and she had this really horrible relationship with her kingdom, so she slaughtered all of the people and now they're dead. And if you've played Slay the Princess, you're like, oh my gosh, Lauren, why are you inventing a story on air? And I'm like, I'm inventing it because that's kind of the expectation, right? That
yeah,
players go into it when you hear just the words slay the princess, right? So I think that it's really going to be a really interesting conversation for us to kind of go through and understand and break down that entry point into the game, the actual game construct itself, and that multiverse you're creating, and then, right, the actual narratives and the story that kind of come from it.
yeah. And so to explain the classical narratological distinction between story and narrative, so story is essentially the what happens. It's the like the totality of events as they play out. And then narrative is then how those events are related to whoever happens to be experiencing the piece of media in question. And so this can apply to, novels, it can apply to film, it can apply to choral odes, it can apply to video games. And video games in particular have a lot of really unique and interesting ways in which narrative is then sort of like depicted and structured so as to be interactive and various other things. So the how of the game is really sort of its visual novel structure and sort of like the branching paths that exist within it. And then you can really sort of think of the story of the game as sort of like then what happens within like the particular like branches you happen to go down. That's the classic distinction. It gets a little bit more complicated once you get into sort of narratological theory and like semiotic analysis, but that's kind of all you need to know in order to understand what we're going to be talking about today. So the game starts off with, well, actually, it has a so strangely enough, it starts off really simply. Like you're somebody because it doesn't actually explain who you are, at least not right away. You're just in the woods, and a narrator, a voice, comes up and says, basically gives you an extremely brief grounding and why to save the world you have to go slay the princess. And then from that point you're kind of then left to deal with what the narrator is telling you to do, much like, in the Stanley Parable, although it's a very different game from the Stanley Parable. But it has that similar kind of vibe where
Right.
like there is a narrative voice that's telling you what is quote unquote supposed to happen, but then you as the player get to choose what actually happens.
Yeah, and once again, coming back to that like narratological theory here, is that it's called a narrator for a reason. It is narrating the narrative.
Yeah.
I'm being very dumb and pedantic today, but I'm really, really honing in on this because this is one of the kind of entry points into this kind of game that I had going in. That as soon as you have a narrator, you ask one of two questions, particularly in literary theory, which is it a reliable narrator? Or is it an unreliable narrator,
Yeah.
right? And this is I once again, I always feel very like dumb and pedantic when I start asking these questions, but on this podcast I am trying to be a little bit more kind of heavy-handed here with my approach to kind of really simplify to so that when you play Slay the Princess, you understand that this is an unreliable narrator. Pretty much from oh, hold on. Let me make my argument
Okay,
and then
okay, okay. I
we
guess.
can
All right, go
refute
ahead.
my
Go
argument.
ahead. I'll
Okay,
shut up.
right? When you enter into the game, you're pretty much confronted with this as an unreliable narrator. You get in, and immediately, as a player, you have like 8 different questions you can ask them. Why are you here? What am I doing? Do I even want to slay the princess? And immediately you are positioned into a point of kind of agitation with the narrator. Immediately you have conflict. And it's not quite an act of violence per se in the traditional sense, but it's absolutely right. At the end of it, the narrator is like, could you just please stop? Just stop and let us kill this princess. Just
Yeah.
trust me. Just trust me.
Just do it.
And it's psychologically, right, one of those really nice tricks you have, because in a game you can talk back to your narrator, whereas in a book, if you started talking back to the narrator and the narrator answered you, I would be a little bit shocked of the book or yourself. There's only two objects there that can
Yeah,
be
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
at play. But I think that it ends up creating this perception of like the narrator is not on my side. And I think that as you then continue onward through the game, you have that unreliability. You can't trust the narrator. And I think like that's where I'm going to end my argument here, right, Nicholas, so that you can kind of come in and talk about maybe that the reliability of the narrator in this, because he is the one telling you he's how this should play out. And that's going to create a different story should you go his route, because there's many routes,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So for me, the reason why I understand what you're saying, because yes, like from the get-go, the narrator tells you to do something, and then when you get that very first selection of like thing of responses, there's a lot of them, and most of them are in fact not just going straight on to the cabin to go kill her. Most of them are like, what?
Yeah,
Or
surprise Pikachu.
huh? I don't. Or alternatively, you can actually from the very beginning of the game just be like, fuck this, I'm out, peace out,
Mhm,
I'm
mhm.
going. That doesn't work, by the way. Spoilers. Well, mm, it doesn't
Once
work in the
again, it
same.
creates a different story.
Yeah, yeah. You don't get to piece out of the game, but a very different thing happens. And so, what's interesting about the narrative, and so the reason why I balk at the notion that it's an unreliable narrator, even though I understand why someone would initially think that, is because, well, first of all, there are ways in which the game actually then does come back around to sort of re-justifying doing what the narrator tells you to do. Like, you actually, over time, the more you play the game, you develop new reasons for doing exactly what the narrator told you to do in the first place. Additionally, it's kind of unclear to what extent you can talk about the narrator having any kind of intent, really, at all. The narrator very much comes off as a kind of mechanistic thing. And in fact, there are a lot of instances where, in particular, like Divergent Paths, like the narrator kind of breaks down because the narrator can't actually evolve as like the changes you make in the world like play out. Like the narrator is kind of stuck in this repeating pattern of like saying, if not saying the exact same thing, saying the same kind of thing over and over again. And this goes to such an extreme that in one instance, if you go like way out of your way to like, okay, so I have to guess we have to establish the basic pattern. So like the basic pattern of each like iteration
Yeah.
is you start in the woods, you proceed to a cabin in the woods. Inside the cabin is a door and a knife on a table. Sometimes there's a mirror. You go through the door into the basement. In the basement, there is a princess chained to the wall, and that's where you're supposed to kill her with the knife or however you manage to decide to do it.
Yeah. And I think we also, like always, we kind of jump in right at the heart of
Hmm.
like what we're wanting to talk about. And I think, like Nicholas said, if you take a step back, Slay the Princess, which you can download on Steam and find kind of like the introduction to the game there, is a sort of looping game. So it is a
Yeah,
looping narrative.
yeah,
So what this means is that every single time you enter into the game experience, you are going to kind of repeat that experience each time. And like Nicholas is hinting at, the goal is to not get the same experience each time, because that actually would like kind of hinder your progress, right? And
yeah,
with so many options that you are presented to, and not all of them like upfront options, like not all of them are telegraphed, right? You kind of have to
yeah,
figure them out.
yeah,
Each option starts the same way, with a princess, you being in the woods, that or a princess that needs to be killed,
yeah.
you being in the woods, you approaching the cabin, you going down into the basement, and there is a princess.
The reason why I bring this up is because in one of those iterations, when you go down there, if you go out of your way to refuse to do anything that might even suggest that you have any intent to kill her, at one point the narrator actually will take over the you, and I'm saying the you as sort of like this abstract objectified thing, because there are also open questions as to what the you is in this game. So it takes over the sort of the first person perspective that you have through most of the game, and tries to force you to kill her anyway. And that's then when you get a series of like options where you can try to resist or you can acquiesce. But like the narrator wants the pattern to play out the way it's supposed to play out so stridently. It's not strident. So like severely that he can and will try to take over your body or like the avatar's body in the game.
And to be clear, the narrator only does that once though. And I
Yeah.
think that the ability of a narrator, like in Stanley Parable, you have a pretty reliable narrator. Like he is just telling you what you're doing. And he starts by telling you it was just an every other day and now Stanley is doing this. But it's always you. Even when it's wonky and the narrator's like, "Wait, hold up. Am I my own creation? Like am I,
Mm-hmm.
something?" Like the narrator is like only going to talk about what you kind of as the player already know or are about to experience or have experienced or being begged to not do a thing because the narrator doesn't want you to experience it.
Yeah.
Versus in this case, I would argue that the narrator is unreliable and that the narrator takes over who you are, right?
True, but what I guess what I'm trying to suggest
Or
is
maybe
that
that's not his
yeah,
reliability.
it's unclear what animates the narrator because like the narrator can also be taken over. There is one iteration in which like the princess in the particular form that she adopts at that point actually then takes over and sort of like they double speak. You hear both the princess and the narrator, but they're
Oh,
saying the same
yes.
thing
Okay.
because the princess is essentially controlling what the narrator says. And so the thing is, that's why I try to say that it's like it's more mechanistic. And so like talking about its reliability or unreliability is maybe not the most appropriate way to think about it so
Or
much as
maybe
like is the narrator like functioning the way it's supposed to or is it breaking down?
I see. I guess it is interesting because like in one instance, right, it's kind of like the literary sense of like what does the narrator kind of bring to the equation of the game.
Yeah.
But in the other, it's actually like, well, because this is a game, the narrator is a mechanic. It is
Yeah.
actually functional and it
Yeah.
needs to function as something.
Yeah. And plus you also have counter narrators in the game. They're not called narrators, they're called voices. So you have the voice of the broken, the
Mm.
voice of the opportunist, the voice of the cold, I think is one of them, voice of the hero is one. Uh
Yeah. I
yeah,
like
it's
how the
there's
voice
a
of the
lot.
hero was like it's the first one you encounter, by the
Yeah.
way. If we're
Yeah.
going to talk about discovery, right?
That is true.
Here
So
soon.
yeah, you hear the
So,
narrator and then the first voice to challenge what the narrator says because usually these voices are actually challenging the narrator. They're not going along with it. The first one that you get is the voice of the hero, which Lauren notes. I mean, Lauren, if you have anything else to say about this, I want to let you speak first since you brought it up. But the hero is then sort of the archetype for how you as the player are supposed to behave in the game. So there is this kind of like mechanism that the game is laying out, and it is the basic mechanism of most games. It is like, here is the task that has been assigned to you, here is the role that has been assigned to you. Now, unlike most games, actually, you get the choice whether or not you are, in fact, going to adopt those tasks and adopt those roles. Because in most games, in order to play the game at all, you actually have to do it. You have to do the thing that you're told to do. Otherwise, the game just doesn't progress. Whereas in this game, the game can still progress if you refuse.
and so I think this actually brings a really nice kind of like bow tie on like the whole framing and discovery of the narrative of this game for me. Because as Nicholas pointed out, I wasn't looking at the voices as narrators as well, but I'm actually glad that I brought up the unreliability of the narrator so that I can talk about it because this is more educated. Because I was going to say the voices themselves were characters, but
Yeah.
actually, in fact, my argument is stronger when I say that they are like opposing narratives
Yeah.
and rules for the player to play.
Yeah.
Because in each of these loops that you play throughout, the first one is always do you kind of choose to kill the princess or not?
Yeah.
And or also then how do you choose to kill the princess and or when do you choose to kill the princess? Like right away, you do it cold-blooded, you just try to get it out of the way.
Yeah.
Or do you actually wait and you kind of stumble and hesitate?
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think the most like violent thing of these of Slay the Princess is actually in the ways you get killed by the princess. And so I'm bringing this up as well because that is how it's reset. Like that's the frame of the of the story of what is happening,
Yeah.
right? Is that while the game is telling you to kill the princess because she's going to kill you, you are going to get killed. Like the narrator, the one that is the narrator, that's his title,
Yeah.
right? Versus the voice of the hero is the one that I kind of chose to be like the antithesis of it, because at the very end of the game, I would say the voice of the hero kind of comes back in a stronger way than the other voices do.
Yeah.
And so he's the one that's trying to save the princess, right? Because heroes save princesses. They don't.
Yeah, and in fact, the voice of the hero
Yeah.
even says that at one point, like,
Yeah.
"Don't we save princesses? This doesn't make any sense." Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that it's that compatibility that when you do each loop, you get a new voice. And the new voice depends on the end of the first like frame of the first sequence.
Okay,
Did
yeah,
you
that's another thing that we need to talk about is that it's not actually as simple as like woods, cabin, basement, kill,
uh-huh,
because
uh-huh.
actually then within a given sequence, that cycle repeats, but then the cycle that you see the second time is fundamentally different and dependent upon what the choices that you made in the
Yeah.
first one.
Like for me, I didn't and what's interesting too is they kind of in the it's Lauren's moment of tiny critique time, is that in within the story itself, there are certain segments of the story. I just wanna say how impressed I am with the game. I'm gonna compliment sandwich this, like, critique, I guess.
Yeah.
But I am very impressed with the game because if it had just been, like, myself or just Nicholas, like, it is very hard to make every edge case accounted for. But there
Yeah.
are moments where voices that you have never experienced before towards the end of your sequence of your run of the story, like, come through, and that voice for me was the voice of the smitten. And I was like, "Where the hell
Oh,
did you come from?" Because I never chose
really?
that route. And so
So,
on my second playthrough, I went, "I'm gonna get this. I'm gonna get that voice. I know it. I know enough about this game by now. That's gonna be my first voice after the hero." And it was. And I found out how to do it. But
yeah.
like, I literally was like, "What? You can just." I mean, I kind of knew you could probably do that route. But the
Yeah.
voice of the smitten is like the one that is like just, I am unadulteratedly one-sided slash in love with this princess.
Well, yeah, and it's
Right?
also it results from the one where you literally take no aggressive action whatsoever. That's the only way to get that one. Like
It is the only way to get that
you
one.
can't pick up the knife, you can't hesitate. You're just like, no, saving, save, 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 save.
No, it's like the mercy run, and then
Yeah,
instead of, like, the mercy, right, you get the voice of the smitten, like, just hopelessly in love,
yeah,
right? And I think that's that and I bring that up because it is, like, the foil. That is the true foil, right? The voice of the hero isn't a true foil to, say, the narrator who's like, "Kill, kill, kill." And I would even argue that the narrator himself isn't also like, "Kill, kill, kill," right? But that every voice gives you that perspective of, like, commit violence, and then there's a ton of voices for how did you commit that violence?
yeah,
And then there's the voice of the hero that's like, well, I guess like she is about to come at you with a knife, so you probably should come at her with a knife, right? It's like self preservation, but not quite because there's a voice for that too.
yeah,
So I think that like when we talk about the ending and we talk about the roles to play, it really does actually become like which narrator are you following? Like do you continue to follow the voice of the smitten during your run through with that voice, right? Of okay, I'm not going to take any aggressive action.
yeah,
Because as soon as you stop listening to him and you do listen to the hero who's like, well, you are the voice of the smitten, but you ended up getting killed, so you should take the knife this time. Then you no longer will get like the same roots ending, right?
yeah.
Like you have to do so much with so many forks and branching in this game that I think that's quite impressive, despite the fact that, you know, after so many runs and stuff, you just start hearing the voices and like they're kind of all blend together. Um,
Well, yes and no, because the thing is that so the voice of the hero always remains distinct from the like voice of the adjective.
yes, yeah, voice of the adjective, voice of the noun, voice of
Yeah,
the role versus voice of the adjective. That is also a really good literary device that they did
yeah,
there. Yeah,
yeah.
I didn't think
Because the thing is, so for anyone who hasn't played the game, diegetically speaking, the nature of the voice of the like insert whatever it is here is only in the U's head, because the when it comes up at one point where you get to ask the princess if she actually has voices like this in her head, and she's like no, and in fact at one point she can possess you, and she's like, oh, so that's what's going on in here. So those voices, at least as far as like the story of the game is concerned, they originate within the avatar, the you that you inhabit. And so as a result, then, like, on the one hand, yes, they have this like narrator like component because also the narrator only exists in your head. But what makes them a little different from the narrator, and why I think Lauren says that they're kind of like a counter narration, is because they originate through this character that you are now embodying.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so, like, strangely, then you as the player, actually, you don't necessarily embody the avatar, you embody the contradiction. So, like, because you experience the narrator and the voices in many ways in kind of the same conceptual plane.
Yeah.
In fact, they're literally the same voice actor. Just doing different voices. And it's great. I will note that, like,
Yeah,
I
he's laughing because he's out of actual joy,
yeah,
not
it's really
of
great. It's real
critique.
yeah,
It
the
is
voice
fantastic.
yeah. And it's a shame that I think the princess is not quite up to the same level. She has some bright spots, but I think it's uneven in her case. But the narrator, oh my god, the narrator and the voices, he does a fantastic job.
Well, I love both of them, and I think that's intentional, and we can go into voice
Okay.
acting and the intentionality of that if we wish. I wasn't actually going to bring this up, but now that you've mentioned it.
Yeah, just go ahead. Riff.
Yeah, okay, so I think that when I was hearing the voice actor for the narrator and all the voices, I personally was like, all of these voices are the same voice. And I love that for me, not the narrator's voice, excuse me, but the counter narrators. And
Yeah.
I loved it because it's like playing a D&D session with like one of your best friends, and then he's just like going to town.
Yeah.
He is just at the end of the table, and like when I closed my eyes, I was like, that's what I imagined. Was like this guy's just going at the end of the table, and the reason why I think it was intentional is that there is always, and this also comes from me being a writer, so there always is like the first iteration you write, or the it could be, and I say the first, but it could be the second, the third, the 100th, but it's the iteration you write where you're like, man, if I was to play this game once, this is the iteration that I would play, right? And
Yeah.
I don't think that the author ever intended there to be like an intended canon, because when I do branching narrative, I also don't intend there to be an intended canon. But there's the one heart of the character when you give voice acting direction, that in the counter narrators, the voice of the hero, the voice of the smitten, it's like it is your best brother's D&D. It's his guy, and he's giving all you voices, and it's like you are a contradiction. But with the princess, it's like you are this singular entity. And even though she's made up of all these different pieces and different parts, her voice kind of remains the same, because I think she is the same, like character is what I mean.
Yeah.
Even
So,
though she
okay.
changes personas and visages and forms,
Yeah.
right? At the end of the day, she is still the same princess, versus you, the player, and you, the voices, are always playing something different.
Yeah, and I think we should talk about sort of like the transformations of the princess, especially as relates to sort of like the larger topic of violence. Because, so to preface this, you eventually come to discover, if you if at the very beginning when you're plopped down in the woods, if you decide to peace out and sort of like commit to like refusing to play the game the way the narrator tells you to, you will eventually then get shunted into sort of like the multiverse framing of the whole game, in which you will encounter this entity that at once is the princess, but then also sort of like is evolving as you go through more iterations of sort of like the basic plot. So like the more experiences of, or more variations of like the princess storyline that you go through, like the more this particular character will develop. And there then becomes this sort of like not even really a conflict, but sort of an open question as to like whether the violence perpetrated within the context of the game is in fact necessary. And in fact, the otherworldly entity even says to you that like it doesn't bother her, because like even if you violently kill her, or like things transpire in like incredibly grotesque violent ways, like each time that's a new perspective. And every time you as the player, in fact she even refers to you as a player at one point, every time you as the player like do this, she evolves. Like she incorporates that new perspective into her being, and then she like grows as a result. And so then at that point, the game has essentially told you, actually, that thing that the narrator told you to do at the very beginning that you were questioning is actually necessary. Like, you cannot get through the game, well, you can get to the credits in a very dumb way, and in a way that they sort of explicitly signal is, you did it the wrong way. But for the most part, to get to the credits and to get through the whole sequence of understanding who this entity is, like, you actually do have to do some of the violent ones. You actually have to kill her sometimes. And you have to kill her in various ways. And sometimes she has to kill you. In other words, violence becomes necessary for how the narrative will play out. And that violence sort of exists on many levels. It exists in the level of the story in terms of what happens. So, like, you go down with the knife and you attack her and you stab her in the chest, or you go down without the knife and then the two of you actually fight and maybe you kill her, maybe she kills you. But it also exists in the level of, like, the sort of the branching logic of the game itself. In other words, you're not allowed to have one clean narrative, like, through line. You actually have to break it. You have to break the narrative. You have to sort of, like, creatively destroy it. And it is through that act of creative destruction, that violence, that you get the fuller experience of what the game is trying to sort of, like, do to you as the player.
Yeah. I think like talking about the destruction of the narrative is actually really helpful here because we've been talking about branches and we were talking about and we've been hinting at the multiverse
Yeah.
of this. But talking about it with the actual act of violence that you participate in is that there are very easy ways and clear ways, I think, that we could visualize this in our head pretty simply. And it starts with, right, a linear line of woods, right, cabin, and then you already have choice. It's kind of knife or no knife,
Yeah.
right? So 2 branches. And then based on that, it basically explodes into like dozens of options. I'm sure like I could actually count them, but let's just say each one of those branches, knife equals 12, and then no knife equals 12.
Yeah.
And even though you're getting the same dialogue responses, right? This princess has like that many reactions to you, right? And that's what we're counting these branches off of. So
Yeah.
you can automatically already now go, wait a second, you're already like 3 branches into your story or 3 kind of plot beats, you could say, into your story. And you've already got 24 different outcomes. And that doesn't even include, like, you could say act 2, which is loop 2, or act 3, so loop 3, right? And that's kind of how they've trimmed the branches. But I kind of point this out is because there is no through line through the story. And that's why I'm saying I don't think the author ever had an intended through line, right?
No.
But and it had the art of violence in its narrative already, like
Yeah.
structurally.
Yes.
There was no beat to beat. And I think that's incredibly important for you guys to hear from Nicholas, is that the creative destruction of narrative kind of almost came into its act of violence and, well, how are you going to kill her?
Yeah.
And like that's why I loved this game, was because I was like breaking it down. And hopefully the visualization, right, kind of looks like veins, looks like something crazy and creative so you can see it. Because ultimately, after 5 segments of that, you basically then are kicked to, you could say, a converge. Like if you wanted to make any sort of linearity through this, please don't.
Yeah.
Save yourselves, right? Do not take upon that violence against your head. But if you wanted to, it would converge right into the entity has been formed, right?
Yeah.
And that form, that structure equals now the ending, and the ending being more branching, to be completely honest.
Yeah, exactly. Because how you respond to that entity and what the entity wants you to do, because once again, you're put in a position where, like, much like the narrator telling you what's supposed to happen, like the entity then awakes and comes into being, and her like godlike state, and she tells you, okay, well, like, this is what I am. This is now what we're going to do together. But you don't have to do that at all. In fact, there are even multiple ways of doing the thing that she wants you to do. There are multiple ways of not doing the thing that she wants you to do. And so, like, even at that moment of convergence, even at that point where it's supposed to be culminating, where it's like, oh yes, okay, we're back in plot land. Finally, we've got a beginning, a middle, and an end. Oof, I can wipe my. No, actually, it explodes at that point. It's like, no,
Yeah,
actually, now this.
it just explodes. I think
And-
No,
Sorry,
and
go
I
ahead.
think that's a really no, I think that's a really good way for us to kind of segment into like kind of the latter half of the talk where we wanted to talk kind of about like all of the different acts of violence, all of the
Yeah.
different, I don't want to be like murderous intent, but all of like all of like that kind of pent up interplay between the princess kind of knows you're coming to kill her, even if you don't say you're coming to kill her. Like she kind of gets it, whether or not you have the knife in your hand.
Yeah.
She's obviously a little bit more like, you're not coming to kill me when you don't pick up the knife, but there are more options with the knife
Yeah.
than without the knife. And
But
I say
also,
options, but I
yeah.
mean outcome. To be fair.
Yeah. I was just going to note that, like, the mere fact of what's interesting is that not only do your choices transform the narrative, your choices also transform the nature of the princess herself, at least within that particular like variation that you play through. Because like in the same way that like picking up the knife, choosing the option to pick up the knife, then shunts you into a certain subset of branches. It also now means that like the princess is not going to respond to you with anything less than suspicious intent, because she has now been changed by the act that you perform. And not only that, but also then when you play through like the first cycle within any given like run, so to speak, as if because it has a lot of roguelike qualities to it. So like
Uh-oh.
within that particular run, like you then either stab her or don't stab her, but then like the next time you go back through and sort of replay it, like she will often be radically transformed, not just in terms of like her demeanor towards you, but like she can now go from being like a cutesy like peach like princess in a freely dressed to like a domineering goddess or a weird creature, or like the choices that you make literally transform her.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely got Domineering Goddess on my first playthrough. That was my first
I
choice, I
did as well,
guess.
yeah. It was
Yeah.
not my first, but I did get it.
No,
Yeah.
it was my first. I don't know how I got it. And I also don't know how I got. So we are now going into spoiler territory, so we will denote it somewhere. I mean, we've been spoiling the game, but this is real spoiling whenever you start talking about multiverse, okay?
Yeah.
But like I got Domineering Goddess on my first one, and I really wanted an option that was like, I guess try to defeat God. And then it was like, no, it was just submit or submit, but with pleasure.
Yeah, exactly.
And I was like, of course this would be my first one. What is going on? Like, and it's because I honestly didn't quite know how to make a decision slash choice in the first act
Yeah.
slash couple first acts of this kind of narrative, right?
Yeah.
And I think that like it's one of those games, much like a roguelike, where you are cognizant of stuff that's happened in your previous run. So there are
Yeah.
kind of two really great like narrative design tricks here. Like the first is that you've got a narrator, and then to be fair, the narrator does not remember that you have done a previous run.
Yeah.
But you and your voices remember, and you keep your voices each run. So you've got two. That's kind of what creates the multiverse, which then narratively allows you as a designer to just then pocket every single version of the princess's reactions to you as
Yeah.
kind of a unique chunk of content. And so that was really, really nice because now we can talk about they are all different universes. Like it's not just one narrative with a bunch of branching choices and then a consecutive ending. It really is lots of circles of content on a Miro board and like an image of like, in this one, the princess is going to become a domineering goddess. And in this one, but only if you have engaged with, say, chunks, domineering goddess A and domineering goddess A, right? And intro A7974
Yeah,
dash
no,
B. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it is.
I'm super glad that you brought up the Miro board. And the reason why is because as I was playing the game, I didn't notice this at first, but I started actually thinking of it in terms of like design tools. So the game was made in Ren'Py. So for all of you out there who are thinking that you can't make a really fantastic, like award-winning game in Ren'Py, guess what? You can, because it's been done.
That wasn't it. No, that was RPG Maker.
Yeah.
Sorry, keep going.
So having made a game in Ren'Py myself, like I started to actually see the game in terms of like the way in which you structured the code that you write. Like I literally started to see it that way, and I was actually able to anticipate how to like get particular like vessels or like perspectives, variations on like the princess, by thinking of like, okay, how would I have structured this in Ren'Py? And I was right. And it also then later made me think of just like the way in which you design games period nowadays. Like, if you open up Unreal Engine and you start to set and you open up Blueprint within Unreal Engine, like Blueprint functions a similar way. You place down nodes and then you place the relationships between those nodes, sometimes values within nodes. But like that basic structure or the way you do it in Twine is actually very similar as well. Like strangely, even though the game is not trying to openly signal to you its underlying mechanics in the way, say, like a Disco Elysium is, like, I started to think that way. I started to see it.
Yeah. And yes, I absolutely saw it. Now, I said it in Miro because, like, whenever I do a lot of my story plots, I absolutely do story plotting in Miro. And
Yeah.
I do think non-linearly by default. So a lot of my initial stories really just look like a bunch of like wires and plot like little rounded squares because I hate well, one, I hate squares slash rectangles because they're too edgy. I want some nice soft curves on my squares.
Okay.
Now we're getting into design land,
Yeah.
like graphic design. But because then the harsh squares are frames or are like actual like Alan Wake style fucking black like plot boards with these note cards on them. Like I just
Yeah.
remake a storyboard physically in Miro, and it's all nonlinear. And so it's like, oh man, this is the scenes that I need for this character because like she's gonna have the reveal. I literally have no idea where I'm putting that reveal. I have no idea. There's no act structure, but it's just gonna go over here for now, and it's there labeled clearly.
Yeah.
And so for me, I bring up Miro because I do that all the time in nonlinear design. So now I'm looking at this, or like you'll have a bunch of locations, you know, the artists are made. So you're stitching all the locations on a board and you're like, I have no idea what writing is going to go in a, you know, dog park. Why are we making a dog park? When will we ever need it? Shit, level design decided to put something there. All right, quest in the dog park will be X, right?
Yeah.
Like, please find fluffers like you know, nuggets or something. I don't know.
Can I highlight something that you said? Because I think it was actually
Yes, highlight
incredibly
it.
brilliant. When you were talking about sort of like the way in which you lay things out, you said explicitly, I need these things for this character. I need these bits for this character. That's literally what the game is having you do. Like,
Yeah.
you need to accumulate these like narrative bits in order for this other character, the weird divine creature lady, to evolve. In the
Yeah.
same way that as a designer, in fact, as you specifically, Lauren, like assemble these bits in order to flesh out and make your characters feel real for the players that you're designing for.
And that is exactly why I loved this game, was because I was like, I am playing like a writer's first game. Like I am playing someone who's like, man, I'm just creating these things and these are the things that I need to create a character. Oh my God, what if all of these voices and the narrator were just all different versions of me trying to figure out what the fuck I'm doing so that I
Yeah.
can create this like actually good, multifaceted, deep character, right? That maybe
Yeah.
someone will want to romance in a game because I really want to work on like Dragon Age. You know, this is obviously me from like 10, 15 years ago. Maybe me today, who knows?
Yeah.
And I just that's exactly right, like kind of what you're like what you're going through. And so for me, the Miro board was stronger than Ren'Py, but to be fair, I did try Ren'Py,
Yeah.
and I could see this working as a really good, like, I don't want to say blueprint game, but I can see how you would do it in Blueprint.
Well, that's the
Now that
thing.
you mentioned out the blueprinting, and now I'm just going, oh my gosh, like I'm a writer who's a game designer who now is used to implementing all of my writing in games. And now I just cannot. Now when I play this beautiful game, I'm going like, man, I can see.
Well, no, and that's the thing. The reason why I tried to make it generally about design tools because you know a lot of design tools have the same underlying logic.
Yeah.
Like even though like the particulars are different, like the basic structure is the same. And so the game is saying that actually the narrative structure of a game also works like this. Like
Yep.
there is a kind of logical relationship between the two of them. But rather than it being a game in which it's like, okay, now you're going to like literally open up a simulation of something like Blueprint and construct a narrative, it actually still like presents it to you as a classic video game narrative. Like
Yep.
it's not revealing so much as like insinuating. It's like the way possession works in the game. Like there are various ways in which you can think about possession. So like there's literally one point where your actions in like you know your first go around will cause the princess to become a ghost, and then in your interactions with the ghost you can either resist her or you can in fact actually let her possess you, and a lot of really interesting things happen if you let her possess you, not just in terms of like what you find out about sort of like this world, but also what the princess character discovers about you as a result of being inside quote unquote your head and the voices and whatnot.
Yeah.
And so but then there's but then there are also like analogous forms of possession in like the various ways in which the princess dominates you. So like the super divine goddess princess, as Lauren pointed out, like doesn't really give you the choice of obeying or not obeying. You can obey or you can obey happily. But in many ways, that's the game taking control over your choices as a player, in the same way that the ghost of the princess takes over your body so that the two of you can leave the cabin. And so like even within sort of like the thematic structure of the game, there's this weird way in which sort of like violence and dominance especially then become an avenue for you to sort of think about how the game functions. Because what you get in the form of like this like woods, door, basement, slay the princess, like that's a gameplay loop. It doesn't say explicitly like, hey guys, look, this is a gameplay loop, but it is.
Right. And before we go back into like, obviously it's a loop, it's a narrative loop, it's a game loop. Like that's why I'm talking about it feels like writer's first game. And it's like that is not a critique or like anything. That is like a genuine love. I am saying that
Yeah.
is that it takes the loop structure in such a fundamental way and then wraps everything around it. And I think what's really key to point out with Nicholas, you talking about like the nature of like the ghost possession, or you could say the narrator possessing you, is that it really puts the player into a role where then they want themselves, like want to possess, right, a trope of, am I gonna just go super hard into, yes, I'm in love with her, right? So I'm the voice of the smitten, or am I going to actually change halfway through because you know what, actually I should have killed her, like
Yeah.
I thought I was going to be in love, but actually I'm not. And that in itself has a different incarnation of the princess after it. And so I think like this is a lovely way to kind of like wrap up this talk here as well, to talk about the way the princess kind of transforms based on those actions. Because
Yeah.
I think that a lot of the times when we look at games, and even in like writing, like games that are more say like narrative designed, like I guess driven or bent,
Yeah.
right? Is that this is the first game that actually just goes in out of its way to talk about how, not the first game I should say, but there's others out there, but like this is the game for me, the first game for me that really talks about how like slay the princess, you must perform a violent act. You
Yeah.
must be complicit in the violent act, right? And let's like setting aside some of like the mercy runs, right, from Undertale, or, you know, the non-combat ones, is that in any time you do not perform a combat action or violence, the princess then, right, performs that violence towards you. Like there is one,
not always, but 9 times out of 10, yeah.
yeah, but 9 times out of 10, right? I was like setting aside the ones where there actually is no violence in them, right?
Or she'll sometimes and I will note that in some of the instances where she doesn't perform the violence against you, she does it to herself. She doesn't
Yes.
kill herself, but she will, in fact, in one iteration, she'll gnaw her arm off in order to get out of the chains. And you can then either choose to assist her and be like, oh no, well, the knife will be much like, okay, I get it. You don't have to try and chew your arm off. I'll go get the knife and we'll just cut your hand off so you can get out. But if you refuse to do it, she will continue gnawing her arm off until she's free.
Yeah. And it's insane. And I think like this is why like because this is going to be a really nice kind of segue into our Patreon episode, we're actually going to be a little bit more philosophical and talk about the actual aesthetics of violence and how violence is portrayed. I think that Slay the Princess is an incredibly like violent and gory game, and it even says that right up front. Because so much of the acts you as the player can choose to do are to engage in what I would consider mutual violence in this form of kind of like in this narrative, because the princess, as soon as you say you're violent, the princess is going to be violent, like as soon as you pick up the knife. And you can even toss it aside, you can give it to her, you can do whatever you want with it, but it's now violent. If you don't come with the knife, you can still be violent, because thou shalt have arms, and arms and hands can become punchy material, pew pew, with your fists. And so I think that like the nature of violence for me in this very much showed how I wanted to create the character or the entity, right?
Yeah.
Particularly because then you have the collection mechanic kind of after you complete the game, right, one time.
Yeah.
So you get to see that all of the options that you missed, but not in forms of branches, like in a Detroit Become Human style game.
Yeah.
But in a, like just these are the things you need to collect sort of experience. And so I think that actually like reinforces the actual narrative of violence in the game is that like, hey, you weren't as violent as you should have been in your first run, so now you need to actually do really, really violent things. Or hey, you were too violent in your first run. The hashtag Warren. So you need to now not be violent, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point because it always works dialectically in this game. The game never says that like, oh no, you should have done it this way. Because like then if you do it that way, then it's like, oh well, no, maybe actually you should have done it this way. And in fact, a lot of the sort of the necessity of violence and sort of like creative destruction, I guess is the best way to think about it, is actually implied in moments when you choose not to act violently. So, for example, if you go whole hog, in other words, in order to get the voice of the smitten, the thing that you have to do is you have to like deny any intent whatsoever of doing anything violent at all. You have to reject it at every turn. It's like, I'm going to save her, I'm going to save her, I'm going to save her, I'm going to save her. But in that instance, if you do that, what happens to her, she becomes like more sketchy, quite literally. In fact, the visual representation of the princess character, like each time you refuse and each time you be like, what do you want? What do you want? And like if you keep pushing in the direction of like, I'm not going to do, I want you to tell me what to do. I want you like I'm not going to do anything. Like literally the visual representation of the character goes from being sort of like the way in which she's typically depicted to like a little bit more hand drawn, to hand drawn with like things that have been crossed out, to like what almost looks like a paper cutout of like the way like a fifth grader would have drawn her. And so she becomes like less real and more fabricated, more artificial, the more you lean into the I'm going to save you, I'm going to save you, I'm going to save you. And the implication there is that like, well, there has to be some amount of violent interaction or at least antagonistic interaction between yourself and the princess. Otherwise, she becomes a kind of nothing.
And I think that's really, that for me right there is a really great way to kind of underscore the aesthetic of violence, because then at the very beginning of the game, it is not just talking about how like you need to slay the princess. It's like, remember, this is a love story.
Yeah.
But when you are the voice of the smitten, you are reducing her potential as a character to something that is the kind of trope of what you think love is.
Yeah.
But then is it in fact love more in love with someone when there is an antagonistic relationship with your partner? Like there are many, many different types of questions and theories you can take from this game.
Yeah.
And I think we went with the aspect of kind of violence and framing and narrative because that's what we do here.
Yeah.
But also like I highly encourage you to play this game to kind of not undersell it for the types of depth that Nicholas is describing here, as well as then, ideally, coming with us over here in our few minutes, but your couple days, to listen to our Patreon, so that we can actually talk about all of these more in depth with you there.